Okay, this is Guy and Jeff. We're here to talk about selling the cloud, and we're just trying to figure it out, and we're having a dialogue about it. This is our first episode.
Yeah.
So first off, I'm Guy Reams. I'm currently in a sales leader executive position for a company called Insight, and this is Jeff Bozic.
I'm Jeff Bozic, currently in a technical leadership role for Insight Enterprises.
So we are having a dialogue today about, we're just trying to figure it out. You know, we come from a traditional company that sells technology, typical data center infrastructure. And for the last several years, we've been trying to figure out how to sell the cloud. and I have to be, and we're going to talk, we have a topic to talk about today, but I just want to talk about this because I think we both realized when we first started out, there was this notion, which I think we innately understood to be false. But there was this notion that the cloud was nothing more than resources in a different format. So we're used to selling storage and compute and blah, blah, blah. But the cloud was simply storage and compute and blah, 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 but just in a different form factor. Mm-hmm. That was kind of the way infrastructure people helped themselves feel better about selling cloud, right?
Yeah.
And so I think we kind of innately knew that was wrong, but I think we kind of we let the industry lull us into the fact that might be true. But I think we've learned as we've actually practically gone out and sold or helped a client pursue a path to the cloud or putting applications in cloud infrastructure, I think we've learned that that's not true at all. Sure, we're using compute and disk and storage and networking and all the things we're used to selling, but it's a different animal altogether.
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately the cloud changed the consumption model, both financially and of how you're actually consuming those resources, the capabilities of infrastructure resources. I do think infrastructure people tried to just say it was, a flex pod in someone else's data center for lack of better way to phrase it, to feel better about it. But I also think that's how initially people thought it was to be consumed. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding of why a lot of the cloud services came about, the benefits of them, and how that consumption model was to be leveraged. I think a lot of people thought it was kind of a solution without a problem of, hey, I have this new way to consume infrastructure as a great solution, but I don't know what problem it solves. And so trying to just leverage it in the way they had in the past was how they were thinking about it and how we initially were thinking about it as well.
And that ended up being folly because meanwhile, the application development, the company, what was really going on that the infrastructure people were ignorant to, I think, was that application teams were starting to use the platform to develop their next tier, their new round of applications. And they didn't always do that in the same way. Right. It's not like they're using serverless compute in Amazon or Google or GCP. They might be using a VM, if you will, in the sky, but they were using different deployment mechanisms, different code writing. I mean, there's been new languages that have been written in the last 2 years that the average infrastructure person wouldn't even know. Like, it's funny, if you asked an infrastructure person today, name the top 5 programming languages that are being used today in the cloud, they would still stick with,
C, Python,
JavaScript,
Java, yeah.
right?
Yeah.
C++, C#. They might say that one,
Yeah.
but they wouldn't say any of the new languages
Right.
that have come out of the woodwork. I mean, maybe they would think they were cool by saying Python, but even Python has become just a utility language. It's not even what the developers are using today. So that's just interesting that the infrastructure teams are out on the wings. But I think I want to get us to the point we want to talk about today. The problem is we've had this rationalization period, which I still think is happening. People have used the cloud for new applications. They developed applications in containerized systems in Docker. They can deploy quickly, push it to the cloud. Application works. Problem is those applications are growing up now. They're becoming production, and now companies are rationalizing cost, rationalizing speed of it and efficiency, ability to get those applications deployed fast. We spent a lot of energy trying to figure out how to deploy it. Great. Now I want to automate that as good as fast as I can because I don't want to have to go through that pain again. Can't we just hit the easy button? Why do we need to, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So they're rationalizing it, not just from cost, but from efficiency and everything else. All those things, security, I think is part of it. So they're trying to rationalize it, and that's bringing IT back, kicking and screaming into the conversation. But I think what we're discovering is the customers, the client base we're used to talking to it's like teaching them a new language. It's like we're speaking French, and it's like we have to teach them how to speak French, and they're just like, well, I don't understand what you're talking about. And I think that's what we're talking about today. It's like in a roundabout way, we're struggling because they hear us talking about the really cool cloudy or app dev type of discussion points, and they're like, yeah, that's it. That's what we want to know. That's it. You're right. That's what we want.
I think it all generally comes back to the question of why. You know, what's the point and why are we doing this? And it's interesting because as we're talking, I oftentimes relate a lot of this, you know, transformation that we're going through, especially to the infrastructure side of house, to the VMware revolution. You know, VMware really changed the way that IT shops operated. That technology changed efficiencies of how resources were consumed, how they're provisioned, how they're even purchased, how they're utilized, the operational process of, you know, spinning up a server. It did shorten a lot of lead times. And as you're talking about that, I started thinking about why did people have this perception? You know, where did this perception come from of how cloud should be consumed? That ultimately, to your point, I think was false. And I'm wondering if a lot of it isn't because of VMware. And if you think about the point of why VMware exists, and I actually use this point when I talk about containers all the time, and how containers and VMware are completely different technologies that solve completely different problems. Yeah. And what VMware was solving was resource utilization, optimizing resource utilization. I had these, you know, servers that were running an application, and I'm utilizing, you know, 1-3% of my CPU and, you know, 10% of my RAM. That's a lot of waste, right? And it's just stamping out a server per app. So being able to consolidate a lot of that. And if you think about public cloud, I think there was this promise that, you know, because I always ask, why do people think it was cheaper? Why would anyone believe that renting something is cheaper than buying it? That doesn't exist in anywhere in life of anything. Now, if you look at just the period of which you rent versus buying, then yes, in that comparison, sometimes renting can be cheaper than buying. Obviously, if I fly to Seattle and I need a car, it's going to be cheaper to rent a car than to buy a car. But if you look at the overall total cost on a per hour basis, obviously buying is cheaper than renting. So why do people believe that they could just rent compute in this temporary fashion? It sounds great. And so I think people believe that there's this resource optimization of, well, I can only, you know, I only pay for what I use and when I use it. But people it sounds great. It sounds easy. But that was never the intent of the public cloud. And there's no mechanism to really do that easily. Even today, public cloud's been around for 10 years, and there's still not tools or good mechanisms to very easily understand when can I spin things down, when can I spin them up, when can I shift from a bigger VM to a smaller VM so that I can, you know, save cost. You know, when can I shift tiers of storage to save cost? So yeah, that ability exists, but it was kind of this folly thing. So I think it ties into the conversation we talk about of value. People were looking for value, and they believed that there was this value of cost savings with public cloud to be able to, again, you know, control your resources really granularly. But to your point, that was kind of a false belief and a false myth. And that's not really the benefit of public cloud. Now, you can leverage that to be its benefit, of course. It's really difficult to do that. And is your application even designed to be able to be spun up and spun down?
Well, I think what we're discovering is we're walking into environments where, I mean, let's just be honest. The app dev people, application developers don't really need a rationalized environment to be successful. Their goal is to develop applications rapidly. Now, I think where they're getting into the problem, though, is when they start to try to build a deployment or a continuous integration model where they're writing code and spitting out changes as quickly as possible and having that integrate throughout their entire app stack, and do that with as little pain as possible. They want to accomplish that, so they're looking at all these tools that enable that to happen. So they're just out there scouring for all the, and there's thousands of them. And we've been in partnership now with 6 or 7 of them this year, but they're all coming out of the woodwork. And so you've got these app dev teams that are just trying to figure out everything they can to make that happen. The problem is we still got this really ugly truth that somebody needs to manage and operate the environment. If you don't manage and operate the environment, if you don't provide some rigor around the management of the environment, it is going to have a problem. It is going to get out of control cost-wise.
Or out of control some ways.
Or tool sprawl is going to destroy you. I mean, you know what I mean?
Well,
so IT is necessary. What I'm trying to say is IT is necessary.
So,
but it's a different type of IT,
That's
right?
dude, man, as you're talking about this and as I'm thinking about it in this concept of value stream, it's becoming more clear to me. And this is kind of what we were talking about yesterday, but not necessarily in this context. If you think about from the app dev's perspective, what is their value stream? And their value stream is deploying features quickly, being able to write a feature quickly, being able to test it, safely.
Well, I think the business would want
and deploy
that
it quickly.
Yeah.
So that is their value stream.
Yeah, and to the company that would be valuable.
Sure, exactly. Right. That's what I mean. Their value
Yeah.
stream as back to the business.
Yeah.
If you think about infrastructure, they have their own value stream that's very different, but is still completely necessary. And that value stream is, optimization of the infrastructure for cost management, reliability of the infrastructure, performance, which is of super value. I don't think, and neither side really sees the other side's value or understands the other side's value, and they're somewhat diametrically opposed. Can you go really, really fast and have an application team that's trying to innovate and do things new with a platform provider, the infrastructure team, that is, not moving as quickly, and they're more focused not on moving quickly, but on controlling costs and stability and security and things of that nature.
But it's absolutely necessary.
It's absolutely necessary, and I think this is exactly what we're running into with our clients and even ourselves. Is both of these value streams have got to rationalize together to become this cloud native world that everybody wants. Where you're actually getting the value out of deploying applications quickly in a cost-effective manner that is safe and secure, regardless of where it lives.
Well, let's even talk about that, because there's a lot of romance about the companies that were cloud native from the get-go.
Yeah.
And they hired dev teams that came in and wrote the app, and they got the app deployed, and they had success, and they got a round of funding. And the problem is once they get up to that number, whatever that is in revenue, like 20 million a year or 20 million annual in revenue subscriptions or whatever the magic number is. I don't know what it is. But once they get there, they start having real problems. Mm-hmm. And I don't think I think it's kind of like this ugly truth that people bury. Like we had a Harvard case study thing where they talked about that yogurt company, the one with the white, the interesting looking yogurt, chope.
Oh, yeah.
What is it called? I'm screwing that up.
Chahobi or whatever?
Or whatever, yeah. The one with the interesting cups. I forget. It tastes kind of nasty now. I liked it initially, but now it's kind of, I don't know why. It seems like the taste has changed. I don't know what's going on. But anyway, it's this really cool company that started up they bought out some dairy farm and they started selling yogurt, and the guy wanted the perfect product, packaged awesome, and he just went after contracts with local stores and he got it out there, and next thing you know, it's just taken off like crazy. But their innovative, disruptive style of business was awesome to gain market share. But at some point, you got to deal with the reality that Kraft deals with, that PepsiCo deals with, that, they all deal with the reality. And there is a very harsh reality that you get to at some point. Now, I don't know where that happens for an up and coming app company or a company that's developing an app. But if you got a really big outfit, like a big hotel chain or a big grocery store chain or whatever it is, and they're developing a new application or a series of new applications, yeah, they want that agile, really quick out to market. But at some point, when users actually start using the application to transact commerce, and that becomes a sizable part of the business, now you got to deal with the reality. And that's where IT gets involved. And I think that's where our customers are at. That's where a lot of the people we talk to are at.
Yeah, it's interesting that you talk about it in that context, because In this new cloud native world, there's this concept of the full stack developer, right? And,
Yeah.
Or this full stack team, where it's a team of individuals that, no application writing, no infrastructure. Maybe they're stronger in one or the other, but they start to, meld their skill sets to be able to kind of know both sides of the fence and be able to, do both sides. I think it's to your point, a very novel concept, but I don't see how that can possibly scale. First of all, I think the skill sets are just different, and not a skill set as much as a mindset. I mean, there's a certain personality type that becomes application developers. There's a certain personality type that becomes DBAs. A certain personality type that becomes infrastructure. And sure, there's some cross melding of it, but I think ultimately people get into IT and their mind works in a way that if you're an infrastructure person, Boolean logic isn't maybe exactly how your mind thinks. You could probably do it, but maybe it's more something along the lines of thinking about reliability and failure scenarios.
Yeah.
How IO, actually goes end to end, which does matter. It's funny how application people think that, the app is what rules the world. Well, it does until things can't communicate, or the infrastructure is not available, or something fails. Then your app is useless. So, how data actually moves, where performance
Or where the
comes
data
about,
is at.
where the data's at,
Yeah.
how the reliability of each component fits together. The concept of site reliability engineering. I always think it's interesting in the on-premises data center. People take for granted that it's, for the most part, a pretty resilient pairwise HA build system. Almost everything is pairwise, fully resilient. As long as the actual physical infrastructure of that data center has, 4 or 5 nines of uptime, for the most part, your entire infrastructure does. Well, as you start moving that out to public cloud or even a SaaS provider, EC2 is 99.97, S3 is 11 nines. If you're using Route 53, it's got its own uptime. They fail over differently. Some are regional failover, some are, overall service-wide failover, some are availability zone failover. How do all those components start to map together to actually provide a resiliency level that you expect for your application? How's your application handling any of it? So, ultimately, I think it boils down to the fact that if you really want to scale to quickly deploying apps and a very, very safe, reliable infrastructure, those people should be part of the same team. Infrastructure people should start understanding application concepts and development patterns, and the application folks should start understanding, what infrastructure provides as capability and how that affects it. But to have this concept of the full stack developer or the full stack engineer, I don't see how that can scale.
Well, maybe for a small company, right? But there's an inconvenient truth that even an app dev team with talented full stack developer type people, they're going to create a working application. Okay, it works. Yep. And maybe it can scale to a certain number of users. But there's going to be challenges that we face in larger enterprise. It's going to happen. Exactly. Once you get up to a certain, there's just things that come up. I don't know if we could detail out what those are, but I don't think we need to. But things happen. Mm-hmm. But on the flip side, I think the infrastructure people, the people that were raised on VMware, which is kind of weird to be saying that, but there were people born with VMware.
I know.
Isn't that weird? Like,
are we getting old or what?
Yeah, there were people like we talk about the VMware revolution. There's like, it's been around since ever.
What revolution? This is how it was.
Yeah, it's always been virtualization. Like I had to explain to my child the other day what virtualization was because my son asked me, and it was a very easy concept for understood. He understood it right away.
Yeah,
no problem. But when somebody tried to explain virtualization to me when it first started happening, I was like, this is a little mind twisting for me, right?
Mm-hmm. It took me a year to wrap my head around how this is happening.
But the point I was trying to get to is I think the IT originated folk, or even the people that I still think IT type folks are still required. Mm-hmm. Those folks that are trained and that are going to have to wake up to a new worldview too.
Oh,
for example, relational database management systems are still around and still needed to be managed. Mm-hmm. Still need to provide all the infrastructure and appropriate stuff that we had to do before. But man, they got to deal with the fact that data is not all going to an RDBMS anymore. I mean, let's be honest. I mean, one application, one database is very real. I mean, applications are writing to their own data sources.
Oh,
So dealing with data lakes and data segmentation and silos is part of your job now as an IT guy. Get over it. You're going to have to deal with it.
and new technology. If you look at a microservice, a truly cloud native microservice based application, every microservice likely has its own data store behind it. And it's very likely that there are 6 or 7 different types of data store technologies sitting behind the entire app. One could be using RDBMS. One could be, even if you say NoSQL, there's 3 or 4 different types of NoSQL databases.
I know, yeah.
You can have, log structured file systems that they're leveraging for log streaming events, things like Kafka. And so that is changing drastically. And not to say the infrastructure team's job isn't changing drastically, and it is probably more so than the app dev guy's job is changing. But to your point earlier, data is going to live everywhere, so you still have to manage it. If it's in public cloud, why do I want my app dev guy to try to figure out what is the right cloud storage tier to give his app the performance he needs? I don't want him to focus on that or to think about that or to spend time learning it. I want him to figure out how to write code faster or the new language.
Or what is
some
the length of subscription you need.
Yeah,
how much should you rent it or should you commit to it for 3 years?
Absolutely. Or the one that we're really helping clients know what they don't know, which is around data protection. As data starts to move and as these data sources start to change and these data stores start to change, how do you protect that? How do you start to protect all these different types of data and where they all are? The data protection can't be this after the fact thought anymore, or you can't just rely on the fact. Again, I think people take the on-premises data center for granted so much every day. The fact that for the most part, you already have a pretty good data protection solution that when a new app comes online, you might be adding a VM to a policy, and that's it. Whereas in this new world, with the cloud native app, you have no idea where the data is living, or maybe your solution can't protect a Cassandra database. So what are you going to do about it? How are you going to protect that as part of the app?
Well, what killed me the other day, I was talking to an app dev guy or somebody, a full stack guy, and we were in a bit of a debate about this. And he mentioned, he's like, the one thing infrastructure people need to get over is there's no more reboot. There's completely destroy and recreate.
Yeah.
Which I thought, and Owen, get over it. You're never going to log on.
Right.
You'll never log in to the Linux console as root anymore. Mm-mm. You are not going to be SSHing in as root. If you have to do that, there's a failure.
If you have to SSH into a container at all, you're doing something
I know,
wrong.
but from an IT guy's perspective, it's like it's not working until I can log on to it and see the root prompt, or I can see the Windows desktop pop up, or whatever it is.
Yep.
It's not working until I can see. And that's just a thing that people were raised to believe. But he was absolutely right. I mean, if you have to go into the operating system at that level, then there's something wrong with your deployment mechanism.
Well, I mean, and everything changes. Like, obviously security changes pretty significantly, but let's just look at the simple concept of a authentication key. So if you have a traditional monolithic app, or just even a traditional app, that authentication, it needs to authenticate to some other third-party service is probably built into the app or built into a service of the app of how it's authenticating. And that's stored in the state of the application. That's typically stored in the state of the VM or the server it's running in. If I need to reboot it, I just reboot it. If I deploy it somewhere else, that authentication stuff's built in, it goes. If I start to move that into a microservice-based app or some sort of container-based app, data persistence changes drastically. And to your point, I can't just reboot that container and have the app back to the state it was. There's no stored data in a container. I can't have any persistent data in a container. So that means I can't have persistent data in the application. So that means the application state, including things like an authentication key, needs to be stored externally. Okay, from the app guy's perspective, that's pretty easy. Yeah. I just, create a symlink or some sort of a link and some sort of mounted point into the container of a storage location, and I just have some sort of configuration file that has that information in it. And when the app loads, I read that data. Pretty easy from his perspective. Well, where's that data going to be stored? How am I protecting that? Think about the security implications now.
Yeah.
And who's thinking about this? Does the security guy even know that now all of a sudden these authentication keys are being stored in some external storage location? And does he even think about how that might even change how they have to secure it or what the security posture would be? Does the guy storing the data know?
Well,
Does the guy managing the database know?
This is a rabbit hole, but I mean, we've had client examples recently where an app team, taking shortcuts because they wanted to release the code quickly, are using I don't know what we call it nowadays, but using an Amazon or some other place, a code stack that was provided to them, use that code stack, and it came with a whole bunch of bundled software. And next thing you know, executives are demanding that this app go production. They push it production, and oops, some Java runtime was in that package, or some component was in that package that had a known vulnerability, and nobody even bothered or would have even known to have checked it. And when you're talking about not one or two containers, but you're talking about tens of thousands of containers, sometimes one of these applications runs thousands of,
yeah.
and you're right. I mean, that is a rabbit hole, but it's a big problem when you think about,
one shift. Just again, all the how are you protecting that? So that one little change, one minor little change, that's a necessary change. All of the infrastructure components that are affected by that those teams have to now solve for, regardless of where it lives. That's what I people get so hung up on where it lives and who should be responsible for it. I don't understand why just because something moves to a public cloud provider that all of a sudden the responsibility of managing it should change to the app guy. So to your point.
See, that's a clear line of definition but I don't know. I think I like going back to what you said though, the value chain, because of the value stream.
Yeah.
I think we understand the app dev's value stream. It's getting that business requirement accomplished in a fast way, no doubt about it. Speed to market is probably the number one value chain for them. There's probably others too. I'm lightly glossing over that because I want to move to the real problem, which I think is the value chain for IT is somewhat cloudy, right? And I think that's what at the root behind every conversation we've had, where they hear what we're saying and they're like, yes, that's exactly what we need. But then when we start talking about the practical matters, that's when they get really squeamish on us. When we start talking about, we're gonna have to come in and train you how the app team is talking, what they're expecting of you, what they want from you. We're gonna address that with you and train you. That's where they get really squeamish, because then they start realizing the gap between where their people are at and where they need to be, and it's a big gap. So they get really scared about that. And I think, going back to what you said earlier, the thing that's missing is they don't understand the new value stream that IT is providing to the organization, or cannot articulate it well, maybe.
Or I think it's both, quite honestly. I think you're dead on. I think they don't have a way to articulate the value stream up, but I don't think they have a good way of understanding the value stream down. For instance, so what's the promise of public cloud? Well, it can provide agility and scale. What's the promise of containers? Well, I can rapidly deploy at a very, very fast pace, a bunch of instances of an application or a service and scale it out quickly. I can, destroy them and fire them up quickly. I get portability. I get all these great features. And so when you ask people oftentimes why, so going back to your value chain, so why are you doing this, Mr. Customer? What's the value to you of containerizing this app or of trying to move these workloads to the public cloud? And they'll say, well, it's because, I want the agility and scale. And they use the buzzwords. They might actually believe it. And they're true. Okay, yeah, you will get the ability to have agility and scale. Does that provide value to you, though? That's the real question.
Yeah.
And does this app or workload actually need the scale and agility the cloud can provide? And can it do that more safe or cost effectively than you can do it on premises? Because if the answer is no, if you haven't even thought about it, that ultimately is going to decide whether you should or should not do this, or maybe you should focus on another application. So oftentimes when you ask people why, and they give you the generic answers that apply to anything, of course, those are the values that can provide. I'm not asking what's the value that a container can't provide. I'm asking you, what is the value to you of taking this specific thing that you want to containerize? What's the value back to your business?
Well, it's because there's a danger here. There's a danger. we just got on this little slide, which is I need to provide value to the business. And I think the danger of really going too fast for an IT organization is they start thinking like this. And this is what I hear all the time. We are going to provide the platform by which developers will write their code to.
Oh,
right?
yeah.
That is exactly where they go, right? And I think that's the dangerous
We want to build
slippery
something
slope.
that's AWS-like.
Yeah, we're going to build an S3-like bucket. I mean, how many times have you heard we're going to build an S3-like bucket? And I'm just like, I don't know. I understand what they're trying to say because that's the way they view it from a VMware perspective. We're going to provide the infrastructure. The app team will request the resource. We will provide the resource to them, or we'll provide them a portal by which they can self-provision. This is the mindset. And maybe we can spend a second talking about what is wrong with that mindset, right?
Yeah.
Because, and maybe it gets back to what you're just discussing. They don't understand the value they're providing to the business.
Well, honestly, I think a lot of it is self-preservation. I mean,
well, that's true, but in order for them to really preserve themselves, they need to be providing absolute value to the company.
It's what they perceive as their value.
Yeah, but
right?
they're just trying to be relevant by providing a platform,
Yeah.
and that's the wrong attitude.
But if you think about it, in the past that was their value.
Yes.
Right. So they still think that that's their value. And
maybe we can articulate what we think that shift in values become, because I think when we're in those conversations with people and they're in that platform as a service mindset,
yeah,
we got to really articulate.
So you're dead on, and quite honestly, that value prop is I think what the challenge. One of our large clients we're working with that wants to become app centric and cloud native and app focused. That is exactly what I'm seeing as one of their barriers to moving forward. Is the guy that runs all of infrastructure and even DevOps lives under him. He gets it from a technologies, why moving to an app-centric model is important. He even gets it to the point of realizing that, hey, that means I effectively have to servicify my infrastructure to provide a service to the app dev folks. So he kind of understands what the app dev folks want to consume. But to your point, I think the fundamental challenge that he's running into, that a lot of our clients are running into, is still this concept that IT is providing the platform. And that's no longer the case. IT is creating a platform that enables an app dev team to do what they need to do. And that, semantics, whatever words you want to use, it's a fine line, but to me that is the shift. IT still believes that it's, hey, this is what I have, this is what I'm providing to you, and here it is, you guys come consume it. Traditionally that's always how it's been, and the app dev team never really had a choice. And now that they have a choice, and public cloud oftentimes is providing them more the way they want to consume, then IT can't be the one saying, well, here's my platform, come consume it. They have to be the one saying, hey, what do you guys want to consume? How can I provide you a service that will enable you to do what you need to do?
Well, I don't think we'll ever get to the point where you'll stop an app dev team from writing their fully functional code in Docker or in containers using Docker on their laptops. They're going to always do that. Because they're on a beach or at a coffee shop coding away. They're not going to even deal with infrastructure anymore. I mean, it seems like that's the way we're going, where the application can almost be written completely in a self-contained island. And then when they're ready to start testing, they need a test platform to deploy to. So they take their scripts or whatever they took to create that, and then they push that up to whatever test platform that has live connections to real data, so they can actually start testing the application. I'm not even sure if the test environment is, but maybe it is, because a lot of IT guys don't get the need for that app team to have a really highly functioning QA process, test process. That whole has to be ironed out and done in a very rapid way. I mean, legacy IT guys are used to change windows of every 3 weeks or 4 weeks. But these guys are looking at change windows of, noon, 2 o'clock.
And this is, we believe this forever. And I really like the concept of cloud native isn't about where, it's about how. And even when you just say cloud, it really isn't about where, it's about how. Because ultimately, and actually, my colleague and I yesterday were specifically talking about this exact thing of, okay, so you have a cloud native app, and I was asking him, where within if you have a fully functioning CI/CD pipeline of a cloud native app, where within that app does the logic say where it should be deployed? Because if you're back to the resiliency discussion we were having earlier, if it deploys to public cloud, that app is going to have to be deployed in a different way to achieve the same resiliency than if it were deploying to an internal on-premises data center, even if it's in a colo. And so we were talking about this concept that, especially in a microservice-based application, it might even make sense to have maybe not, but it might make sense to have certain services running in public cloud and certain ones running in on-premises.
But in order to make those decisions, IT has to be really intimately involved in that.
Well, here's where I'm going, because I think ultimately the question that a lot of people don't ask themselves, a lot of infrastructure people, is, why do things exist? Kind of going back to the containers versus VMware question. No one actually sits there and says, well, why did VMware exist in the first place? And the irony there is containers existed already anyways. So
yes.
why didn't it win out? And again, people just don't think about that, right? They just hear these technologies, they hear some features, and they just think it's the right thing to do. If you think about public cloud, why did it come about? And it wasn't about replacing on-premises infrastructure. It wasn't about operating in the same way. So it's not about an either or. It's using what makes sense and what's best. But I think what's happening for infrastructure managers and infrastructure people and leaders is it just was there. It goes back to this. They probably just assume it was a solution without a problem. So, there's just this public cloud. It's just there. That's what I need to provide. I need to provide something similar so that it's just there. Well, if the application team's consuming it, then I want to build my own AWS so that it's just there, and then the app team can come consume it. And what they're not recognizing is that it was built out of necessity. It was built out of, there was a problem there. It was built because the app dev teams couldn't get what they needed. And there were already requirements that it was being built towards for what the app dev teams needed to consume.
It's just so much better.
And on top of this, but it is because it was custom built.
Yeah, I know, that's what I'm saying. It's just so much better.
Needs. And then if you think about the innovation that's happening, so going back to the one client that we're working with that believes he needs to servicify his infrastructure. And we were talking about data protection. He's like, well, I just want to provide gold, silver, bronze, or kind of a tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. He's like, if you look at Amazon, kind of similar thing. I can get a tier 1 storage, tier 2 storage, or tier 3 storage. And he was even thinking about storage in that same way. So how do I build these tiers and these classes? I'm like, if you think about, especially public cloud was really around compute to begin with. And there's now hundreds of compute options in AWS. I really don't think that there's a team of AWS engineers sitting there saying, you know what, we think that this is a good machine to build next. No, it's clients requesting it, saying, hey, this would be a great machine to have.
Yeah, you're
it's
right.
It's the app teams or the clients, the consumers, requesting, saying, hey, this is what I need. And then they go build it. They're not trying to pre-build. They didn't pre-build AWS and say, oh, we hope to God this is what you need. Come consume it. They're not pre-building out of some back-end engineer's mind a VM size and saying, God, I really hope someone's going to want to use this. But why does our IT teams believe that that's what they need to do? I need to build this platforms for them to consume. Well, yeah, but based on what they need.
Maybe the mentality is not to build a behemoth platform. Maybe the mentality is to build services that the developers could then start using easier. Like when you're in Amazon, how easy it is when you're deploying that. If I need time service, Amazon's got that.
Right.
I need DNS. Amazon's got that. You name the service. There is a way to get that done in Amazon, and that makes it really easy. And oftentimes they provide you with sample code on how to utilize that. Now they don't tell you that it's an extra cost and it's going to increase your monthlies, but I don't know. I'm still not there yet in my mind. But what does the IT team do? I think we're right. You can't go out there and build the behemoth platform that everybody writes to. That's stupid, or that's not going to ever happen. How are you going to possibly compete with Amazon anyway? Forget it. It's not going to happen. How could you internally? Now, I could understand maybe a large operation like a major bank that just doesn't want their stuff in Amazon. Like, and we're going to make our own data center. Maybe those are always going to exist. Or companies that think they're going to become the next Amazon, or maybe have a fighting chance to do so. Maybe a big service provider.
Or even a company like Hulu or something that has so many developers that they literally develop their own storage subsystem.
So big service providers that have
cheaper.
Big service providers with a compelling need to have their own data center. But even those guys are looking at, I mean, they're building their own compute. I mean, it's a whole different ballgame. So getting back to reality, the customers that we're dealing with every day, the consumers of this stuff, what is it that IT is actually providing? I guess what is the value they're actually providing or need to start thinking about?
Well, I mean, so we all know that going to public cloud isn't cost effective if you're not leveraging it in the right way. So there still is a optimization play. There still is, in a lot of workloads in a lot of industries, a perceived increased security and control of on-premises infrastructure. There are oftentimes, especially at performance, can be a lot more cost-effective for especially storage performance and things of that nature. So I still think, and just companies have a huge investment that they're not just going to eliminate tomorrow. There'd be no value to the client or for clients to just eliminate their investment. So I still think, and on top of that, applications aren't all cloud native. That makes sense in public cloud. Or if you have an organization like some of the ones that we're working with that are kind of well down the path, it still is going to take them a few years to the point where they have even a majority of their apps that are truly cloud native that can actually leverage the benefits of public cloud in a very cost effective way. So they still have to support the legacy. And I don't even like necessarily the word legacy. They have to support the traditional way of operating in a traditional application and a traditional development pattern, which I still think represents not only the majority of our customers, but even our customers that are going cloud native that aren't, a relatively new kind of, startup. It still represents the majority of their workloads. So there still has to be this value. And in fact, this is where a lot of our, I think the IT teams are struggling. One of the large customers we're working with now is trying to figure this out of, well, how do I support this new world while supporting this old world? And they believe that trying to fit that old square peg into this new round hole is the way to do it. So the new round peg fits in the new round hole really well. So let me just build that one behemoth platform that can service the new world and shove the old world into this. And that doesn't make sense, both from an operations perspective, a cost perspective, a risk perspective, security. Yeah. So I think there is this, but at the same time, I don't believe it becomes these siloed. It's not like you have these two completely siloed sets of infrastructure and teams and operational processes either. So how does that team, and this is where I think we can really help, is how does that team figure out how to support the old while still trying to enable the new in an operational model that is safe, that they can work within, that is cost effective. So I think that
really is the rub, right? The rub is you've got these behemoth apps that run the company, and they still do. I mean, let's be honest. You've got Oracle, SAP, you name them. There are these apps that run the company, and all the apps that people are developing usually are pulling data sources or something from those apps. I mean, that's generally the way it rolls. Not all the time, but in some cases. I mean, this is why SAP came up with the HANA methodology, because they needed a faster retrieval mechanism, a different way to look at it, because people were developing so many applications to pull from the data sets and just run it into problems. They had to come up with a new way of handling this, which I think is very forward thinking on their part. But so yeah, you're right. So but we still got these, and that is a fixed environment. I mean, you can't. It's not like you can refactor those behemoth environments really easily.
Not cheaply, no.
So that's a problem. So you got to maintain and support that, and you got to run that, and that requires a certain commitment level. But you also need to be enabling and providing value to the business. You need to provide a secure environment. You need to provide an efficient environment. You need to provide a cost-controlled environment. You need to make sure your data sets are known and established so that you can actually harvest that data at some point in the future. That is probably the biggest value IT provides back, in my opinion. You actually are you are providing the roadmap. You are keeping it governed so that you can know where it's at, what it is, where the resources are at. I mean, it's almost like in traditionally, we used to want to bring IT all into one central spot so we'd have control over it all. But now it's kind of gotten out again. But the problem with that is you're just, your gold is being spread everywhere, right? And so they got to learn to harvest that and figure out how to control that and govern that. And that's a big deal. And all the while, you also got to help the app dev teams build this continuous integration, continuous deployment models. Because I don't think app dev teams have the time to worry about all the gluing together of all the applications and logging and everything else that has to happen to make that occur. And then run the change control process behind that. So yeah, we want fast release cycles. We want them daily or hourly or whatever. Do we want the app dev teams worried about that, or do we need a team organizing that and tracking it and having software in place that manages it? And I think that's IT's new role. But man, what a gap between where they're at now. And I think that's what, at the end of the day, when we were talking to that last customer we were just talking to, when he started to recognize what we were actually saying, I think he realized that when he's asking, so what do I do? Fire all my people and start over? I mean, he was being facetious, but it was actually a very interesting observation, right?
And what's interesting? So we started talking about back to the value stream. So how would a customer? Because the one thing I think is interesting, is if you do ask someone what is the value. I mean, value is obviously a relative term. So even understanding to a client what is the value. I mean, to some clients, cost savings is not the value. Moving fast at an increased cost is potentially more valuable than saving costs at a slower pace. So understanding what value actually means back to that organization, I think is critical. But so how do they measure that? Let's say that is a pretty well advanced app dev team that has gone and figured that stuff out because they've had to, so they can operate pretty efficiently in, say, public cloud as shadow IT. How would you understand the value of saying, rather than your app dev guys spending all that time, to your point, do I want my app dev guys to spend all that time to learn all this stuff of how to glue it together and constantly staying up on what's new in cloud and all the services and the costing of it to make sure it's cost effective and all this fun stuff? If they're doing that today, what's the value of training my infrastructure team and bringing them up to take that role on and freeing up those app dev guys to start developing code faster? How do I know what that value is versus from that client's perspective right now? I can see why he'd believe it's easier just to fire his team because they're not adding that value. But is it of value to have your app dev team doing that? No, of course not. That's not what their value is.
And let's be honest, when's the last time you've had, and I don't mean to be offensive to any app dev people out there, but when's the last time I ever had an application developer care about regimented process and making sure things were secure and
they all
and
say
documented well and blah blah blah. Never in my life.
The worst part is someone will say they do, and then I'll ask them, some infrastructure, like, well, do you care about infrastructure and how? Oh, of course I do. And do you know? Oh, of course I do. I know storage and databases and this and that. And you ask them one or two questions, and they have no idea. Ultimately, they have no idea. So they sometimes think they do, or it's just based on what
we had a memory leak on an application this guy wrote for us. This is a couple of years ago, and he wrote this application that we were running in the cloud, and it had a memory leak, and it was literally over consuming memory on the instance in the cloud. Mm-hmm. And we had this problem where we just had to keep spawning new instances to deal with the memory leak. And finally somebody asked a rational question. It's like, why are we growing memory so fast? There's not that many users expanding the system. I mean, literally, our user growth is very small. Why are we having this memory growth problem? And it's like the developer is almost offended that we would ask that question. But, and we did ask the question. We did go look at it. And sure enough, there was a memory leak. And it was rather obvious once we figured it out. And I think everybody's a little embarrassed. But I mean, that's an obvious example, but just think about when you think about how complex these new modern systems are, all these microservices that glue together, the opportunity and chance for making errors like that is so much greater now than it used to be that
Well, and so, okay, take for example, again, going back to if it's just a developer, if they haven't really load tested their app very well, which many may or may not do, but let's assume they haven't load tested it really super well, so they don't know exactly what its scale is expected to be, and they are trying to use Kubernetes to automate how it scales. So now Kubernetes, with a poorly designed scale set, because you don't know how it's going to scale, is just spawning new instances, and no one even knows that there's a problem because the app is still up, it's still servicing what it needs because Kubernetes is just spawning new instances. And now you don't know until you get your cloud bill back that's 4 times higher than it should be. So this kind of goes back to I don't want to go down the rabbit hole of why Kubernetes is generally pretty bad unless you're a very mature shop that actually understands how it can be leveraged and needs it and understands all the guardrails. You have to be pretty mature to understand how to leverage something like that, but most people don't.
Yeah.
They just throw tools in there. They think their problem's solved. They don't necessarily even know they have a problem in an app because Kubernetes is quote unquote working around it, and it's just wasting a ton of resources, proliferating bad code. Everyone thinks these tools are the savior. They solve all these problems, and in fact, they could be creating problems.
Yeah, and then you get tool sprawl. You got but then again, in defense of the app dev teams, should they really have to worry about this? Maybe IT has been such a laggard in this business that they are being forced to deal with these things when they really shouldn't be.
Well, I don't.
And Amazon has filled that gap. I mean, you're right. Yeah, Amazon is providing at a very rapid clip, and I guess to some cases, or in Google are too. But Amazon's probably is leading the forefront. They are actually providing relevant and real ways for these developers to deploy, and they're solving that problem for them.
So here's an interesting thought, man. And I don't know the answer to this. Do you believe that in most companies that the app dev team actually pays the AWS bill? And the second part of the question is, do you believe that those companies actually have a budget for that? Because how fascinating would it be if app dev, who's just running shit in AWS outside of IT, was actually governed by the same budget that IT is? Because so again, why do you have IT? And why are they so focused on cost control? Because they have to, and the mechanisms by which they are providing the resources is a cost-controlled governed system.
Yeah, you're right.
And right now, the app dev teams, I believe, and maybe I'm wrong, are probably working in an uncost-controlled
Well, I think that's what we're dealing. So I think that is what we are dealing with.
So if all of a sudden an app dev guy had to be concerned about how much cost his app consumed and had to work within a budget, my God, I mean, just
no. But Jeff, I think that's what's happening. I think we are now. The reason why this has become such a relevant conversation with us and our clients is because that's what's happening. These applications that were agilely deployed are now becoming mainstream. They're not becoming monolithic apps. They're staying the way they are. They're still cloud native apps. They're just now mainstream. They're full production now. It's been about 3 or 4 years since this is, and now we're in year 3 or year 4 of this real movement, and they're actually running these things production now with real change control processes in place. And these budgets are being moved to the departments and divisions that wanted these applications. And now they're having to justify you're getting so much revenue from this versus how much cost. And it's not matching up. Like that company in LA we were just talking to. It's not matching up.
Yeah.
The CIO has been handed this big ball of crap saying, yeah, we got our apps deployed. We have users using them, but we have a problem. The costs are way up here and our revenue from those new apps are down here. And now we have to deal with it. And that is why when we're in the conversation talking about cloud native and proper methodology, blah, 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 he's saying, all I need you guys to really freaking do is help me figure out how to get this cost down to here. And we're like, but your problem is when you developed the application, you weren't developing it from cost in mind. You weren't thinking about operational efficiencies when you developed it. And now it's like you almost have to go in and refactor everything to get it down to a cost mechanism that you can actually support. Sorry to break it to you, but that's the freaking reality.
Right. It's that value stream, man. And you know, I think that's why when my colleague and I were talking about this yesterday, and we started talking about this, and we really started to identify that it should be the tip of the spear of the conversation. Because if you start really, and not just asking, hey, what do you think the value stream is, and accepting the fact of, well, I need my app to be scalable and I need to be more competitive in the market, and release features faster. You know, everybody's going to say that, of course, but actually digging into, no, how are you measuring what the value back to the business is, and how are you measuring that the value back to the business is worth the effort and cost to actually make this transformation? And if you start asking some real questions around that, if a company doesn't know, then now we kind of know where we can start to have a conversation. They don't know what they don't know, right? We're in this age of you don't know what you don't know, probably more than most. And to your point, people are being pressured to make decisions, and they are making decisions that aren't fully thought through, or they don't have all the data, or they're basing it off of FUD or some Wall Street Journal article or Gartner, review. So if they do believe that they can understand the value stream, how are they measuring that, and how are they actually evaluating that? And I think if we start digging into that, that's maybe where we can start is, Mr. Customer or Mrs. Customer, if you don't even have the right measures in place to start measuring what your value stream is today or what you expect it to be, how would you ever know whether this is worth it? And if you take your pilot app, which is great, and maybe how are you going to know whether it is or is not actually providing the value you expect back to the business?
I think you're right. I think the real thing that we've been talking about this last couple of weeks that has resonated the most with me is rethinking the measures that IT uses, because and
it's
some
the business, not just
and
IT.
actually, you know what, we're dealing with a bigger problem because a lot of IT organizations don't even have measures to drive their business, and the reason, because they've been able to get away with it. When you're providing a whole bunch of infrastructure and you're simply watching your storage growth, watching your compute expansion, and then you just go to the business and say, we need more storage, we need more compute. That was an easy conversation. The executives didn't like the conversation, but they would reluctantly, okay, I'll give you a few more bucks, go buy some more, whatever. But now we're in a whole different ballgame, because now you're right. The resources can expand at will and shrink at will. It's a whole different ballgame now. IT actually has to know what they're talking about, which means they have to have appropriate measures. And so not only are we teaching them what a measure is or what it should be, we're teaching them new measures that they may not have even considered before when monitoring a modern cloud native development environment.
You're so right, because the measures, and as we're talking about it, to me it kind of goes back to, I forget exactly what we were talking about earlier, where we were mentioning how each individual technology manager within an organization kind of has their own self-sufficiency. If you think about the goal of, say, a storage team, it's storage uptime, right? So all of the measures they're putting in place are to provide value to them to know whether storage is up, whether it's available, whether it has the capacity and performance, right? So for storage, is it available? Do I have enough capacity and enough performance? So all of their measures are self-fulfilling to themselves to make sure that that is their value. When ultimately now in this new world, yeah, those are obviously critical, and those measures need to stay to make sure that that team can do their job. But ultimately, these new measures are about how's this providing value back to the business, and it's a new way to think about it. And maybe those traditional metrics, maybe some of those will still apply and still be useful. But if you're not measuring them, or how are you measuring them from an app perspective? And then to your point, what are the new measures, and where to start actually understanding what's the value back to the business? Even from really a people perspective.
That is amazing, because that is really the conference. And what a obvious thing to say, right? It seems painfully obvious, but when we talk about cloud and all this stuff, we forget that it is a business with a desire to make money, to have profits, to have revenue that exceeds their costs. I mean, duh. And we want to have a rational environment. So when somebody's talking to us about cloud and challenges with the cloud, the first topic is, what value is the business expecting of you, and how you are going to measure it? Because if you're not going to have that conversation, then I don't know how to help you, because we got to, you know what I mean?
Well, and I think what's becoming clear to me is how we help, because it kind of goes back to this. We always talk about building the bridge. between, DevOps was claiming to build the bridge between dev and ops, and I think we're all recognizing that that is somewhat short-sighted, and obviously security needs to be involved and infrastructure needs to be involved. All the teams of IT, and now even parts of the business of marketing and the feedback loops and things of that nature. So even if we just look at IT, so you have these two different value streams of what the application believes their value stream is, what the infrastructure believes their value stream is. They also don't understand the interdependencies between them. So how can the application team, they don't necessarily understand what a measure or a failure could potentially affect downstream into the infrastructure and its value back to the business or lack thereof. And the same way going upstream, right? An infrastructure team doesn't necessarily know how measures or changes in the app team could potentially, or on their side, could potentially affect the application. So if you start thinking about, because if you truly start understanding what the value stream decisions are, start to become things of, what's the technical debt that's going to be incurred? What's the cost of the full-time employees and their efficiency gains? What's the cost of rework of failures? What's the cost, how long can you identify failures? What's the potential revenue effect of getting a release out faster? What's the potential revenue loss of having downtime? Well, those are combinations of both of these sides of the fence. But if you don't understand how they can affect each other, how could you even understand where to measure?
Well, that is really the
measure,
value that IT that is the value statement for IT.
Right? Isn't
it's
it?
like we can reduce the time to resolution. We can improve improve the speed in which changes are rolled out.
Mm-hmm.
These are the things that IT could actually start providing as a value to the business.
Think about like an application measure. I don't know, maybe transactions per second. I'm not, let's take anyone. What if the IT team could come back and say, look, you guys can do everything in the world from an application perspective, and you can only get it so far. But look at what we can do that can now start to improve that measure. But the app team, again, they don't understand potentially what that value upstream.
Yeah,
is,
they have no idea
downstream.
what an efficient IT organization that's used to thinking the way they are, what they could actually do to help improve.
Exactly.
I mean, because right now you've got these willy-nilly app dev teams, which are usually working on different teams.
Right.
They're not using the same tools. There's no uniformity.
Exactly. And the vice versa is true. So think about the team managing the RDBMS system, and they're sitting there saying, well, dude, our uptime's great. Our performance is great. Like, what could possibly be the lesser value here? What more could we provide of value? And the app team is saying, well, because it's not scaling the way we need, and we need to move it, or it doesn't have the performance that it might be performing as fast as you want it to be, and could be healthy from your perspective, but it's not providing the app what we need. And so maybe we do need to move it to a Cassandra type database. Yeah. So the IT team is providing all the metrics that they can of the value that they're providing up, and everything looks copacetic, but ultimately it's not providing the value back to the business because it's not what the app team needs. So, I mean, this misunderstanding goes both ways of what do you measure and where, and how do you actually correlate these together to understand.
Yeah, it's so interesting. We spend all this time on uptime. And the cloud is, I mean, it's still there, but cloud has made uptime kind of, infrastructure uptime is like not a factor as much. It's still there, but is it the main factor? I don't know.
Well, you know what though? I think, I remember one time.
Latency is a big deal these days still. I mean, it's just interesting. I think we have a lot to learn here though, Jeff. I think we need to spend some time really understanding what these metrics.
Potentially, because I don't want to go down this rabbit hole on this. It's a great topic, but not for today. One thing you and I were discussing, this was probably about a year and a half ago, and this is very clear to me because this to me is kind of an interesting shift in my mindset, is we were talking about public cloud and why are we not selling public cloud to clients and this and that. And you made the comment of something along the lines of, other companies are helping clients successfully get to public cloud. And I remember sitting there thinking about that. I understood, it took me a while to think about from your perspective what you meant by successfully selling public cloud. As from a sales leader's perspective, people were selling workloads in public cloud. They were running there. People had production workloads in public cloud. Seemed successful. Mm-hmm. But when I sit there and think about what is success, I have no idea whether it was successful or not, because just because it's running and just because it's working doesn't mean it's done right or well. And for instance, resiliency, first and foremost, it's a insurance policy. If I never have a failure, I could run on an entire dedicated stack that every single component is a single point of failure. And if none of them fail, is it a successful deployment? From one perspective, yeah, because the app's always up and it's running and it's doing what it needs to do and it's serving its clients and it's making my company money. From my perspective, no, that's not a successful deployment, because any one component failure causes the entire app to go down. So is it successfully deployed? I have no idea. I don't know if it's secure. I don't know if it's resilient. I don't know if it's available. Or I don't know if it's highly available. I don't know if their S3 bucket is totally open to the world. I don't know if they have, one shared login that every single developer uses, and 3 of those developers just left and went to another company and took that login and no one changed it. I mean, you have no idea, right, of how it was deployed. So it starts to me to get this understanding of, again, how do you define value, and how do you define success? But ultimately, getting back to, does it make sense for an organization to make some sort of a transformational move? What's the value that IT is providing? Even what is the cost of downtime? So, I mean, US East has gone down a couple of times in the last few years, and there are plenty of companies whose, apps were completely offline.
But how many times have you heard an IT company, an IT organization, spend an overemphasis on uptime in Amazon when there's really no understanding whether that application even needs it or not? Like, there's I mean, I've heard IT guys say, things like, we need to absolutely make sure that Amazon's going to be stable and up all the time. And it's gone down. But they can't tell me what the cost of having 5 minutes of downtime with Amazon having a blip. Is it really worth having subscribed units in 2 different areas of the world, so you have full redundancy? Because that's complicated to do that. It's not easy. Having your app span multiple territories in Amazon is not simple science.
Nope.
And that's going to be expensive. You're basically duplicating your environment. So for an IT guy to brazenly say that we got to recover from every possible downtime that Amazon could possibly have, and that's our new value. That's not, once again, they're not looking at the real value of it gets back to what we were saying. Is that the value? Is total uptime the value to the business or not? Because that's really a question, right? Because you can spend a lot of time, even with disaster protection, they always talk about it. We got to spend all this money and effort they're just trying to be relevant. The IT guy's trying to be relevant by providing backups for the cloud. That's what I'm going to do. That's the value I'm going to provide to the business. But does the business really need it to be backed up?
It's a good question. I mean,
and if they do need it backed up, do they need it restored that quickly? Maybe not. Maybe they just need an insurance policy. And it's okay if it's 30 days old. We just need to have our code backed up, good to go. The data sits somewhere else, we're fine. But nobody actually thinks about it from that perspective.
So are we uncovering? Because I completely agree with you. I mean, now that you mention it, man, back in the day, everything had to be 5 nines, right? Everything had to be 5 nines or more, and ultimately that led to an app that was likely 5 nines available. At least the infrastructure it was running on was likely 5 nines available. No one really talks about the nines when you start moving to public cloud. And in fact, I remember the first reInvent I went to, the most valuable session I went to the entire conference was a dude that got up there, and he was one of the authors of a lot of their well-architected review documents. And he started off by talking about uptime. And he's like, who here, kind of believes that their apps need 5 nines uptime? And pretty much like everybody's hand went up, right? And then he said, does anyone understand how difficult and expensive it would be to build a 5 nines app in AWS? And, no one raised their hand. I was kind of looking around. And he started to talk about what it would mean to build a 5 nines app in AWS. And again, it goes back to just even understanding what's the uptime of each service. And then how does each service fail over? So then how am I going to make sure that service fails over in a way that provides 5 nines of that service? And then I have to do that for every service and then combine those all together to ultimately achieve a 5 nines uptime. And everyone in the room was pretty much like mind boggled, like, holy crap. But what's bizarre is you don't even hear that conversation anymore. Of uptime. So are we stumbling on the fact that uptime isn't as important as people thought and people never needed 5 nines of uptime? Or are we stumbling on the fact that value stream is really, really difficult to measure, and so people are just ignorance is bliss, and they're just throwing their hands up and saying, I don't care about it anymore?
It's probably a bit of both. I think there has been a migration, a shift. I think this has been a problem in IT all along, and I think they've been able to hide behind infrastructure.
Yeah.
And now Amazon is because there's competition. So Amazon is competing with all IT infrastructure, right?
Right.
It doesn't matter what you're buying from whom. Amazon's competing with that. So now there's a real competitor in the mix, and there never has been. An IT guy could say, well, I need to buy HP, or I need to buy Dell, or I need to buy this, or I need to buy that. But no matter what, it's going to cost $1 million. But now you've got this real competitor out there. And I think there's a lot of exposure going on. Right? So that's interesting to say. But yeah, I think we can wrap up. I think to summarize where we're at, the cloud conversation is a value conversation. Mm-hmm. It's a conversation about what the app dev team and what IT can provide as value to the business.
I would just say in general, IT transformation is a value conversation.
Yeah, the ability to transform the organization, it has to be centered around the value that your division or department is providing to the organization. And if you want to do that successfully, you have to really understand how you're going to measure the value that you're contributing.
Yeah, ultimately, I think that is a great summary. And I think for folks that are trying to help clients through this, is what I'm at least starting to internalize is if we can have that conversation up front and really identify where customers at and understanding the value stream they want to achieve in the first place and how they can measure that today or what gaps they have, that'll help you start to dictate how to start helping this client in a better way. Are they actually mature and are actually ready to start consuming services to help them cost optimize or move to the cloud or become more agile as an overall IT operation, and truly move into a CI/CD pipeline of cloud native development? Or do they need to have a little bit more strategy and assessment and definition of value, and maybe starting to understand where to put those metrics in to start measuring whether or not the transformation they want to achieve is of really ultimately worth it to the business?
I think our next conversation is starting to explore what value IT can provide in this cloud native world and how we would measure it. Yeah. I don't think we answer that in one conversation. I think there's probably many topics, but that might be a way to frame our next conversation.
Yeah.
All right, good. Thanks, Jeff.
Yeah, thank you.